In preparing for today, you used language I hadn't heard before. You said best practices in the disability inclusion and accessibility space is to move towards a social model of disability from a medical model of disability. Can you can you please explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, for sure. So October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and I'm so excited to have this conversation this month in particular. But the idea of the medical model of disability is that it views disability as a flaw or a defect in a person. So this model would say, for example, that I am blind, there's a flaw or defect in me. The medical model of disability has largely been rejected in human rights law and in approaches to equity and inclusion. It's instead been replaced by the social model of disability, which now forms the basis of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act in the US, the United Nations Convention. And the social model of disability basically says that disability is not a flaw or a defect in an individual. Disability arises in an individual's interaction with the designed and built environment. So, what does that mean in really simple terms? In simple terms, the medical model of disability, as I said, would say that my blindness is a flaw or a defect in me that needs to be fixed. The social model of disability, however, would say my disability arises in my interaction with the world around me, which was designed for people who see. So when you think about it that way, the responsibility then to make systems more accessible, to foster more disability inclusion, is not about something in me that needs to change. It's the
Mhm.
work that we all need to do, that non-disabled people need to do, to make sure that the designed and built environment is accessible, that we remove barriers, and that we create spaces where everyone can belong.
Oh, I love that so much. And then, first of all, can you tie that to the workplace? And so for corporate workplaces, for some of the leaders joining today in particular who come from workplaces where we don't talk about social anything, how can we incorporate this language into our leadership and DEI programming?
That's such a great question. So the social model of disability, I say the best way that it can be incorporated is by moving from a compliance standpoint to a conversation about an inclusive mindset. So the idea is less about here are all the things we can do to ensure we're complying with the law, but instead, here's an organization that we're striving to build. We want to make sure that this organization reflects and serves the world in which we live. And the only way that it can do that is by eliminating barriers so that everybody across all backgrounds, dimensions of diversity, lived experiences can be a part of that organization. And what that means is moving from compliance to care, moving from a
Right.
set of rules to a set of responsibilities. What are we going to all do together to build an organization where people can thrive?
And we're going to come back to this point, which I think you're so insightfully spotlighting in this moment about how to better integrate disability inclusion into our overall DEI programming. But I think the point that you're raising is really important because I feel like when I first started my DEI practice now over 15 years ago, when organizations would bring me in, they'd often say, okay, well, we do discrimination and harassment training. Can you build on that? Or wanted to connect the inclusion programming to the same kind of compliance, risk management, legal requirements around harassment and discrimination, as opposed to seeing that inclusion isn't just about following the law, it's about culture and it's about humanity and it's about having conversations with people. It's about seeing people for who they are and creating cultures of belonging and authenticity. And I feel like what you're sharing by putting a spotlight on the social model of disability is this idea of it's not just about accommodations, it's
Yeah.
about how do we create a culture of belonging. Would that be fair to say?
That is so fair to say. Create a culture of belonging, and that first requires an awareness of the barriers that exist, a shared commitment to dismantling those barriers, and a collective call to action for everybody across the organization to do the work. So this isn't just the responsibility of one team or one person, but what can we do in our spheres of influence and responsibility to make inclusion a reality?